Can you still see that?
Yeah, it's.
Is it showing?
Yep. We
Okay,
can see
good.
it. Yep. Cool. It looks like the broadcast is live. This is our first tutorial of day 2. Excited to have Stan Hu, who's one of our engineering fellow from GitLab, joining us. I think, Stan, if I remember correctly, I think you started as a community contributors, and I think you may have also been part of the core team before you joined GitLab. Thanks for your time, and we'll let you sort of kick things off.
Great. Well, thanks for the intro. Right? Yeah, I was. My name is Stan Hu. I was a core contributor to GitLab before joining GitLab full time, and at the time I started, GitLab didn't have very good Slack integration, so I built that out and improved it for my team. So hopefully the things I talk about here today will be helpful to people who are trying to improve GitLab or work with it. So let's get started here. So if you go to our documentation page, you Google GitLab architecture application, you'll see this diagram, and there's a lot of different pieces in GitLab. I'm going to highlight today the main ones I think you need to be aware of, and then namely Unicorn here on the left, and it's got GitLab Rails underneath it. There's the GitLab shell component I'll talk about, GitLab workhorse, and Gitly. So these 4 things here are the main ones I'm going to focus on. The other components like Redis and Postgres are standard databases that we use, and I can talk a little bit more about how we use those, but I'm going to focus on these GitLab specific components here today. So I think it's probably most helpful to kind of talk about what happens when you do something. So for example, if you clone a repository from GitLab, what exactly happens? What does the data flow look like? What are all the different pieces that play a part in this role? So let's say I do a git clone for a repo, and on the left you see the user, the client typing git clone some repo. This is over HTTP, by the way, and I'll go into how that's different from SSH in the next slide. But what basically happens when you do a git clone is an HTTP request gets sent up to our web server, which is Nginx in this case. And in this request, you'll see this is not specific to GitLab itself, but this is what happens in your Git client. It'll send up an info refs request to say, hey, what references are available for this repository? And so the first component that it hits here in GitLab is Nginx, and then Nginx basically proxies this to Workhorse. And GitLab Workhorse will look at the repo that you're requesting and say, hey, does this user actually have access to download this data? So what it will do is send up an API request to our GitLab Rails side and say, hey, does this user have access? And this auth check here. And if so, the Rails side, the API will return, yes, this user has access. And at that point, the workhorse will proceed to go and retrieve the data via Gitly, which is our service that abstracts all Git requests. So it's basically an RPC system that takes any Git request and talks to our file servers. And so the workhorse will say, hey, send me this data by executing this command called gitly upload pack. And at that point, Git data will be exchanged with Gitly, and it gets forwarded from Gitly to Workhorse back to the user himself. So this is essentially how Git data gets from the user to GitLab and back. How does this differ from SSH? Well, the flow is very similar in the sense that, but instead we've sort of replaced a number of components. So Workhorse doesn't actually play a role here for SSH. You notice my previous slide, I had Nginx and Workhorse in front, but now that all this traffic is going out through SSH, naturally you hit SSH, the SSH daemon itself. So that request then gets to GitLab shell, which is something we've created. It's sort of a lightweight login handler. And instead of, as you saw on the previous slide, Workhorse sent up the authorization check, GitLab shell now does a similar thing where it requests, hey, does this user have access? The Rails side says yes, and then the flow kind of proceeds similarly as before. So the main difference here is that we're not involving Workhorse, we're not involving the web server. It's all done over SSH, but the model is pretty similar. So I'll talk a little bit about the Rails side, and this is sort of the main part of GitLab. It's all the development is done in the GitLab CE repository, which there's a you can link there. You can the GitLab development kit will help you set all this up, all the different parts that I mentioned earlier, automatically. So you won't have to worry about cloning individual repositories. You can just get your GDK up and running. And I think there was a session earlier this week about how to do that. But you can look at that project page, and there's a lot of details about how to set up your environment. And it'll essentially check out GitLab CE. GitLab CE has a lot of different components to it. I'd say the main things that you should be aware of is that we have API support within GitLab, so all the requests and internal authorization checks are done via an API, and that's in the API directory. We also have a lot of background jobs that run. So for example, when you push something to GitLab, there's a background job that runs after that to figure out like what exactly changed, what merge requests need to be updated when you push, what email notifications need to be sent out, and so forth. So all that is done via background jobs, and you can find the code in app workers. And these workers tend to be very short, small pieces of code. They execute other services and things like that. But it's a good starting point to look like what exactly happens when these background jobs run. The important thing to notice is that GitLab CI, the continuous integration part of GitLab, is an integral part of GitLab itself. It's been integrated in the code base, and you can see that CI related code all over the code base here. It used to be GitLab CI was a separate component that we shipped. It was a completely different service, had its own models, controllers, views. As of, I think, GitLab 8.0, that was all integrated within GitLab itself. So you'll find all the code in there as well. But it's important to note that if you have a question about, hey, my CI, this page doesn't look right, note that it's all within GitLab CE. I talked a little bit about how Workhorse handles all your HTTP requests. I'll talk a little bit about the history first. So in the beginning, everything was in this giant Rails application that I talked about just then. We didn't have Workhorse. But the problem, what was the problem here is that anytime a user did a clone over HTTP, that would occupy an entire Unicorn process. So Unicorn is our application process that runs our web application here. So we might have 20 of these processes in a given machine. And so anytime you did a clone, it would occupy one. And if you had enough of clones going on, all these processes would be saturated and you wouldn't be able to do anything else with GitLab. So the solution that our engineer Yakov Vosimir created was this Go service called Workhorse. And the idea here is that anything that we can offload to Workhorse is a good thing because it's written in Go, so it has a much better concurrent performance and it frees up all our Unicorn workers in our Rails process from doing more interesting things like handling web requests. So you can look at the project page on that link. The main thing you should know is that it intercepts any Git related calls. So in my previous slide, I showed the info refs HTTP request that goes up. Workhorse will inspect the different HTTP URLs and decide whether it should handle it itself or just pass it up to the Rails backend. And that's what I mean by intercepting GET requests, and then it passes the proxies, everything else, and just either will just hand it directly or do some other work. So if you want to look at exactly the routes that it inspects, take a look at that link there. It will show you exactly what URLs are being inspected and which ones are handled by Workhorse and which ones are just passed along. I talked a little bit about how Git access is abstracted by this Gitaly daemon. So in the beginning, we didn't actually have Gitaly. Everything that, all the file access, all the repository data was accessed directly by our application nodes. So we would use network file systems to access this. So every application node had access to every repository. Now the problem with that is that it's network access on Git over a network file system can be slow. So for example, when you do a clone, there might be 1,000 system calls just to open a lot of little files. Now, when you start to think about that in network terms, that can be slow. If you're doing this locally within your laptop, for example, you won't see a big performance hit. But when you start to talk about hundreds of milliseconds, that starts to add up. So our solution here was to introduce this Gitaly daemon. Now, Gitaly, I think, was named um, a while ago because it was sort of like all roads lead to Italy, all roads lead to Italy. Um, so the idea is that all the Git related calls are handled by Gitaly. So, as recently as a month or two ago, we shut off network file system access on our application notes on GitLab.com so that all Git accesses have to go through this service. So you can look at that project page for more details about the status and the progress and all the different things that have to be done. But the important thing to notice here is that it's in Go and Ruby. The ultimate goal is to implement as much as we can in Go because it has much better performance and better memory footprint. But we have the sidecar, this Ruby sidecar that runs alongside the Go service that we've ported over most of the existing code there, so that it leads to fewer bugs in our migration process, so that we didn't have to rewrite everything in Go all at once. I mentioned GitLab shell earlier. So when you try to SSH into a GitLab server, so for example, this is an example here, you SSH git at gitlab.com, you'll see that it says, welcome to GitLab with your username, and then it'll close the connection. So GitLab shell is the component within GitLab that handles this interaction. So when you do a git clone, for example, it is actually doing logging in as git at whatever server you're using. So the link is here. It's essentially our SSH login handler, as I mentioned earlier. But the important thing to notice is, well, how does it actually get called? Well, SSH has this concept of authorized keys. So if your key is authorized to actually log into the server, your key will be added to this file. So when you log into GitLab, typically what happens is that this file is scanned by the SSH server and says, hey, your key actually is in this list, therefore you have access. And so GitLab shell will take over here. You see that in the first line here, the command equals, it's essentially executing GitLab shell with whatever key that it identified your user as. So in this case, it's key 3, which is reflected in the GitLab database as a key ID 3. So that's exactly where it gets hooked into, and then at that point, GitLab shell takes over with all the authorization checks and so forth. So if you're interested in knowing how and improving access via SSH, for example, we had a recent community contributor add SSH certificate support. So instead of using keys, you could have certificates. The first place is to add support in GitLab shell. So that's really all I wanted to talk about today. If there's anybody online, I'm happy to take questions and answer them here at this point.
Yeah, let me check online for questions. I mean, while I do that, David, I don't know if you have any questions that you wanted to ask.
Sure, I do actually. Well, thanks, Stan. That was a really good overview of the architecture itself. So, from the point of view of a contributor, which part of these different architecture components do you think would be easier to start with, as in someone who does their first contribution?
Yeah, so it depends on what you're interested in doing. And I would say, by and large, most people start with the GitLab Rails part because the majority of the code base is in here. That's where all your views are. So people often correct typos and layouts and CSS and things like that. That's all in GitLab Rails. This is where the database models live. This is where our controllers live. So most of the logic when you log into the web side of things is in GitLab Rails, and this is kind of where I started as well, because like the Slack integration is here. But if you're a Go developer, for example, you might be more interested in working on Workhorse or Gitaly is actually a good place to start too, because there's a lot of documentation about exactly where we are, what bugs are out there, and so forth. So I would say that for Ruby developers, it's a natural fit to go right into Rails. And that being said, Gitaly also has a lot of Ruby code as well, and there's a lot of issues and feature requests that might apply to both.
Cool. And then, I mean, what do you think the next steps are? Let's say, contributor has actually watched this session, and they have a good understanding of the architecture. They know what they want to fix, or they know the component they want to fix. Let's take GitLab C, for example. What's the next step in terms of them getting a better understanding of the data models or of the code structure itself? Is there any place in the documentation in particular that you would point them to, or any other resources?
Yeah, so there's a great documentation in our CE repo with that. So in our CE repo, you can go here. Can you all see that?
Yep.
You can go to the repository, and there's a doc directory in there. Um, there's lots of stuff in the GDK as well, but in the development guide here, there's also, let me just pull up the README here. There's lots of links about front end, back end, UX guides, best practices and things like that. If you just want to get down and dirty and look at the code, you can do that. Obviously, we follow the Rails conventions, so things are in, models are in app models in this app directory, views, controllers. So the structure, when I first looked at GitLab for the very first time, was very straightforward, coming from with a limited Rails background. I'll be honest, like 5 years ago, I had a very limited Rails background, but I had heard of these concepts, and so it was very easy to pick up. So for example, if I want to look at, hey, how does a project represented in GitLab? It's all in this code base here, and you can just pull it up and look at it directly. There's a lot of code there, so it's complex over time. It's grown in complexity over time, but the GDK is a great place to start too, because once you have this up and running, the first thing to do is to make sure you can run a local environment of GitLab. Do some local testing. Documentation changes are probably the easiest things that people change. It's all in the doc directory. So that's kind of where I would look first.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Sam.
Sure.
Cool. I think you're actually the second person who said, I mean, you didn't have a like real expertise in Ruby before you joined GitLab. And I was talking to one of the merge request coaches. He said the same thing. He started contributing to GitLab before he joined. And so, I mean, basically his point was it's really not daunting for people to get started. So
No, it's not,
yeah.
and we've designed it so. And if anybody who's willing to just spend a little time can learn, I think the barrier to entry at GitLab. I think one of the things that I was really happy to see is that the code base is really well structured, and there's tests for everything. So it's easy to kind of guess where things are, just by namings and searching. And so I think that the code base is really accessible to anybody who wants to contribute. So yeah, I agree. And there's we use a combination of Ruby, but also on the front end we use a lot of JavaScript. So if you're really comfortable in JavaScript, there's work to be done there too. We use a lot of jQuery, but we're moving away from jQuery. We're using a lot of Vue.js now, and Vue.js has a pretty easy learning curve as well. And so anybody familiar with just basic JavaScript should be able to pick up the GitLab code base pretty quickly as well.
Cool. And it looks like there's a question from YouTube. And I'll read this out loud. Is GitLab currently deployed on to Kubernetes via Helm? Developers are also using the Helm charts for easily spinning up new development environments.
Yeah, we have some customers and users deploying GitLab with Helm charts and Kubernetes. There's a charts project. I'm not sure if DJ talked about yesterday, but I think if you look up GitLab CNG charts, there's this project out there that essentially is trying to Dockerize everything and make it easy for people to deploy GitLab on Kubernetes. For development, there is some effort in the GitLab development kit about using Docker Compose to develop, but that's still sort of in the beginning phases. So you're welcome to take a look at that issue. But yeah, I think for the most part, people are using the Helm charts here. I think I'm not sure if this is the right repository, but I believe it's in the GitLab charts directory here. I think this is the right project.
Yep.
So gitlab.com/charts/GitLab is where you kind of want to go if you're interested in deploying and developing GitLab with Kubernetes.
Yeah, and I think a couple of people already contributed some MRs for charts like yesterday. So let me, yeah, looks cool. All right, so I think that's it for the questions. Let me give it 1 or 2 more minutes, make sure there aren't any more questions online.
Stan, I do have another question related to development. Again, I'm going back to GitLab C in particular, just to pick an example. You were saying that when you started, it was easy for you to pick up the how the code is structured because it's the structure or the way the code is structured and the directories as well is similar to a regular Rails app. Is this still the case, or have we diverged from regular Rails app?
I think it's still the case. You know, if you just by looking at the directory structure here, you can. It's very familiar to anybody who's used Rails before, right? Like a lot of the code is an app. You know, all this stuff is pretty standard Rails here. You know, controllers, helpers, services, views. So it's pretty well structured there. You know, all our tests are in the spec directory as well. So, you know, it's all kind of all the spec directory reflects, you know, the app directory. So for example, if you're trying to test a controller, you'll find, you know, spec controllers. So, you know, this makes it easy to understand, like if I change something, will it break? You know, and all the tests are in RSpec. So anybody coming from a Ruby RSpec background should feel right at home. Like I said, there's also a lot of JavaScript, and I think that's, you know, you can search for it just by doing, you know, looking for JS, and you can see. I'm not sure if it's showing all the code here, but you know, there's also tests for JavaScript. I think both in Ruby and in JavaScript itself. So this looks like actually a JavaScript test. But the structure is very similar, right? You saw the Ruby RSpec stuff. This JavaScript tests are also very much similar in the same vein. For example, you've got describe blocks that show you what you're actually testing. So, like I said, there's something here for everybody. I think you know, we make an effort to test everything we check in. So it's easy for people to jump in and search for what they're trying to fix or improve. And if you do have questions, you know, you can definitely create an issue or ask a question on Gitter or IRC, and somebody might be able to help you.
Excellent, thanks.
Cool. Yeah, I don't see any questions online either. But I mean, for people that weren't able to join live but watching this recording, I mean, feel free to reach out to any one of us at GitLab, Stan, myself, or David, and then we'll be more than happy to help you out. So, Stan, thanks again for your time, and well, I guess we can just wrap this up and end this 5 minutes early.
Okay.
All right. Thanks very much.
Bye.
All right. Have a good one. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.